Do we have too many microservices? That's a question that maybe a lot of organizations are asking themselves, and we'll talk about this today. With me here today is Sarah Wells. Sarah is the author of Enabling Microservices Success. Hey, Sarah, thanks for joining.
Nice to join you. Hi.
Yeah, so you know a lot about microservices, so I thought I'd ask you, what is a good number of microservices? But let's first talk a little bit about your history. So you are an independent consultant now, but you have worked for the Financial Times for a long time. So
hmm
how did you get into the microservices space, and what did you do at the Financial Times?
The Financial Times were really early adopters of microservices. I joined in 2011 at a point where we had a very monolithic architecture. And in 2013, we were rebuilding a couple of our systems and we decided to take a microservices approach. And that was really early. We were very early adopters. There was not a lot of information about the best ways to do it. There wasn't a lot of tooling. So we learned a lot because we would make mistakes and we would go, well, that's not really working. And so they've been running microservices at the FT now for a decade, and you start to feel differently about them, and there are different challenges when they've become almost like the legacy. You know, you're still keeping working on these systems and you're building new features, but you still have this huge estate that you're still trying to maintain and keep up to date.
Yeah, and it's it's funny that you're using that language. It's like microservices as a legacy. That's an interesting point of view. But I mean, you definitely were very early. So
Mm.
microservices, I think the term was first used in 2011. So you were super early in adoption, and very
hmm
early on, I think there was a lot of guidance, basically, that said make them as small as you possibly can. And I think we still see the fallout from that sometimes. And I'm wondering, right? So when we were talking, you had a lot of these experiences where you also probably would nowadays say, okay, maybe we shouldn't have made them quite as small. So what are the things that you have seen where you would maybe make some decisions differently today?
Yeah, well, we definitely were looking at everything that people said about microservices, and at the time in sort of 2013, people were saying there are 100 lines of code. Well, like I wrote Java, nothing was 100 lines of code at that point. Or they do one thing, um, and there was a real sense of, okay, it should just effectively have one API. That's not really that's too small, I think, generally. And I think the things that you tend to see when you've got a lot of microservices, and worked on the content publishing platform at the FT, we had 150 microservices making up that publishing and API um, system, is so you find that every time you need to update stuff, you have to update it 150 times. And even if that only takes 10 minutes, half an hour, it's suddenly a lot of work that you need to do. You generally have an issue around data, which is if you're not careful, you find that you've got multiple services that need access to a lot of data. They can be really chatty because you've got one service that needs to get information from another service to provide a useful API. Suddenly there's a lot of traffic, and maybe you'd be better off not having those as separate services. We found quite often that we had certain services that all changed at the same time, which is usually a sign that you shouldn't really have them split. So I'd say if you're finding that you've got issues around data, particularly if you've got you're starting to talk about doing distributed transactions, you've probably made the microservices too small, because you really don't want to have to be doing that. If you can combine all of that code into one service that owns its own data, that's better. Um, but I think the biggest challenges really are just when you have a lot of microservices, there's just a lot that you have to keep maintaining and that you have to find. And you're sort of like, okay, something's gone wrong. It's somewhere in this stack of calls in one of these 150 microservices. That can be hard to work out what's going on.
But I think, in part, I think you also had a kind of a particular challenge because you were so early on, right? So from what I understand, right, you basically built your own Kubernetes, you built your own backstage, you built your own tracing. So, I mean, you had to build a lot of things that just weren't around back then, right?
Yeah.
That would be different today. So at least these things, I think the pain of those has kind of become a little smaller because you can use tooling that's available. But still, I think the things that you're saying are not just the tooling, it's also the kind of really the granularity of the services. So what are some of the general guidance that you would say? What's a good size to pick? What should be, so it's not the 100 lines. I think, we can definitely agree on that. But is there like some kind of at least starting point that you would give to people?
Yeah, so I think the main the thing that microservices solve is more an organizational problem than a technical problem. And what you're trying to do is to allow autonomous teams to make progress, to have a fast flow of value. So what you really want is for a team to be able to build a new feature and release it to production without having to hand off to anybody else. So you don't want a microservice to be bigger than a team. You want it to be owned by one team. I think that's a really important thing. So that gives you kind of an upper bound on the size of your services, but teams can own multiple services if it makes sense for them to split the logic, because you really want to be able to look at a microservice and understand what it does. I've worked on large monolithic applications with 70 packages, and you just couldn't understand what the whole thing did. One of the things that's great about microservices, you can usually look at them, look at the service layer and understand what it does pretty quickly. So if it's getting to the point where you can't look at the code and work out what's going on, then it's probably too big. The other thing I think is around data. You really want the microservice to own its own data and to not have to make a lot of calls out for other data. That's the second thing that I think around sizing of microservices that's important.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's one of the classics. It's kind of, like a microservice should own its own data. So that's a good thing. And the other thing I find really interesting, because it's similar to, I mean, like a lot of the guidance, at least the early guidance, kind of pushed things down, right? And said, like, make them as small as you can. And what you're saying to me is more aligned actually with what I try to tell people. It's like, make them as big as you can, but without getting into that area where they slow you down again, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's what you're saying as well. It's like, actually make them maybe a little bit bigger, just so that you hit that border where you can say, but you still have self-contained teams that can move.
Yes, and provided you get those boundaries between teams right, so that there is a relatively stable boundary and they're building features within that, then that works really well. So some of it is around the design of your organization to find those boundaries between teams that make sense. Because if you get those right, then the microservices will be self-contained and you will be able to make changes without impacting other people.
Okay, so that means you would actually start with the organizational structure and then derive um, the system from that, which kind of is, I mean, it reminds me a lot of that Conway thing, right? Where
It
you
is
say,
absolutely Conway's law. Yeah.
okay, very good.
Yeah.
Because in the end, right, that basically means that, okay, if I want my system to look like this, I need that team structure to be there. Otherwise, it just won't.
So Conway's law is, I think, fantastic. And as part of writing the book, I went and read the original paper, which is over 50 years old. It's a short paper. It's really good. It's just talking about how when you are designing something, the structure of your organization that's doing the design is going to constrain what you could possibly design. So if you've got 3 teams, you'll end up with 3 systems, and that's what your design is going to look like. And so the idea of the what's called the inverse Conway maneuver is that you deliberately structure your organization so that you can produce the architectural design that you want to produce. And I think that is, I mean, obviously you say just structure your organization. That's not a straightforward thing to do, but you should just make sure that you accept that what you're going to get as a system comes out of that organizational design. And if you've got, you remember the days where you had a front end team, a back end team, and a DBA team. There's a certain type of architecture you get with that, and it doesn't allow work to flow through quickly, because you have to change every layer for every feature change. If you can change the structure so that you have a team that owns customers and accounts, and you have a team that owns content publishing, you're in a much better position to be able to work independently.
But that still wouldn't prevent you from making microservices too small, so to speak, right?
Oh,
Because you could
yes.
still say, well, that team has that, but it now has like 20 microservices and not just one.
It's really it was definitely something that we did in my team at the FT. We had a lot of microservices. They were very small, and I think that if I was doing the same thing now, I would not divide the work up so into such small services. However, I don't. I think once you've done it, maybe it wasn't worth changing because you had these services, they already existed, so it wasn't that much of a constraint. But I would definitely start. I would be looking for what's the build a decent sized service and only extract other service from it if you're starting to find that you can't make changes in parallel and that you're having contention and it's slowing people down. I think it's really about saying we are now stuck because we're waiting on someone else to make a change from a different team. That is a good time to think, can we split this into more than one service?
And now I want to ask you something which is probably impossible to answer, but I still do it. So you have 150 microservices, and what your Financial Times now has 150, and it works. If you could go back in a time machine and build it now with what you know now, roughly speaking, how many services do you think would you end up with? Like half of that?
Probably less. I sort of feel like 20 to 30 is a good number. And I just like to say, if 150 was that particular system at the FT, there's probably many, like there's probably 1,000 services at the FT across the whole of the company. Yeah, I would say that. So one of the challenges we had in that particular team was we had a graph database and we had multiple services writing to the graph database. And I think um, they wrote different parts of the graph, but you still have a problem that effectively the graph database goes down. Suddenly you've lost a lot of services that are not working. So I probably would have tried to combine more of those together into a single service that own more of the graph. Um, I generally find people when I ask people how many microservices do you have, 20 to 30 seems to be a pretty common number. There are obviously outliers where there are companies that have many more, but that feels like a decent start for you're getting the benefit of being able to work independently, but you're not having to go and upgrade like the same library dependency in 150 services, which just takes a long time.
Okay, that's great actually. So now we can end this video with the answers like, do we have too many microservices? And the answer to that is if you have more than 20 to 30, yes. And
I mean, it obviously depends. It obviously depends on your domain and the complexity and the number of people that you have. But I think it probably if you have a service that more than one team is trying to make changes to it, then you've got too few. And if you are spending a lot of time doing upgrades and maintenance and it's painful, then maybe you should look at combining them.
but that's something, as you said, like kind of tactically speaking, joining them actually is not too hard if you discover that you always change those things together. So why not merge them?
Yeah, so the idea is that microservices it's an architecture that enables change, and actually it isn't too difficult to take two different microservices and put them together in one, um, because effectively you're just combining the APIs of them. And we did that. We definitely did that while we were working in FT. We changed our view on where we had the splits. If we saw that we had services that we changed at the same time, it was a good candidate for we should combine these, and we did split them as well sometimes when we found that actually we did find that multiple people were wanting to make changes for different feature work.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I think it's a good response, I would say. To do we have too many? Well, it very well might be so, and you might benefit from at least having a look. And in your book, you also talk more about how to actually make changes. Then once you discover that you actually may have too many, and what do I do now?
Yeah, so my book is really focused on what it means to build and operate microservices for the long term, uh, because actually they should be around for a long time. The idea with the microservice architecture is you gradually replace bits and pieces of it as you need to, but obviously that means that maintenance and support is a large part of what you're doing. So part of that is recognizing where it's not working for you and making changes to it.
Good. Okay, thanks, Sarah, for joining, and I hope that that part of the guidance that we could give here is something that people find interesting.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it.
And thanks everybody for watching. If you liked it, please give a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. Check out Sarah's book. I'll link it from the description below. And with that, we're done for today. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.